Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 12th chapter of the 4th book of Von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, its title being Strategic Means of Utilizing Victory. The text follows. The more difficult part, that is that of perfectly preparing the victory, is a silent service of which the merit belongs to strategy, and yet for which it is hardly sufficiently commended. It appears brilliant and full of renown by turning to good account a victory gained. What may be the special object of a battle, how it is connected with the whole system of a war, whether the career of victory may lead according to the nature of circumstances, where its culminating point lies, all these are things which we shall not enter upon until hereafter. But under any conceivable circumstances the facts hold good, that without a pursuit no victory can have a great effect, and that however short the career of victory may be, it must always lead beyond the first steps in pursuit. And in order to avoid the frequent repetition of this, we shall now dwell for a moment on this necessary supplement of victory in general. The pursuit of a beaten army commences at the moment that the army, giving up the combat, leaves its position. All previous movements in one direction and another belong not to that, but to the progress of the battle itself. Usually victory at the moment here described, even if it is certain, is still as yet small and weak in its proportions, and would not rank as an event of any great positive advantage, if not completely by pursuit, on the first day. Then it is mostly, as we have before said, that the trophies which give substance to the victory begin to be gathered up. Of this pursuit we shall speak in the next place. Usually both sides come into action with their physical powers considerably deteriorated, for the movements immediately preceding have generally the character of very urgent circumstances. The efforts which the forging out of a great combat costs complete the exhaustion. From this it follows that the victorious part is very little less disorganized and out of his original formation than the vanquished, and therefore requires time to reform, to collect stragglers, and issue fresh ammunition to those who are without. And all these things place the conqueror himself in the state of crisis of which we have already spoken. If now the defeated force is only a detached portion of the enemy's army, or if it has or otherwise to expect a considerable reinforcement, then the conqueror may easily run into the obvious danger of having to pay dear for his victory, and this consideration in such a case very soon puts an end to the pursuit, or at least restricts it materially. Even when a strong accession of force by the enemy is not to be feared, the conqueror finds in the above circumstances a powerful check to the vivacity of his pursuit. There is no reason to fear that the victory will be snatched away, but adverse combats are still possible, and may diminish the advantages which up to the present may have been gained. Moreover, at this moment the whole weight of all that is sensuous in an army, its wants and weaknesses, are dependent on the will of the commander. All the thousands under his command require rest and refreshment, and long to see a stop to put toil and danger for the present. Only a few, forming an exception, can see and feel beyond the present moment. It is only amongst this little number that there is sufficient mental vigor to think, after what is absolutely necessary at the moment has been done, upon those results which at the moment only appear to the rest as mere embellishments of victory, as a luxury of triumph. But all these thousands have a voice in the council of the general, for through the various steps of the military hierarchy these interests of the sensuous creature have their sure conductor into the heart of the commander. He himself, through mental and bodily fatigue, is more or less weakened in his natural activity, and thus it happens then that mostly from these causes, purely incidental to human nature, less is done than might have been done, and that generally what is done to be ascribed entirely to the thirst for glory, the energy, indeed also the hard-heartedness of the general-in-chief. It is only thus we can explain the hesitating manner in which many generals follow up a victory which superior numbers have given them. The first pursuit of the enemy we limit in general to the extent of the first day, including the night following the victory. At the end of that period, the necessity of rest ourselves prescribes a halt in any case. This first pursuit has different natural degrees. The first is if cavalry alone are employed. In that case, it amounts usually more to alarming and watching than to pressing the enemy in reality, because the smallest obstacle of ground is generally sufficient to check the pursuit. Useful as cavalry may be against single bodies of broken, demoralized troops, still, when opposed to the bulk of the beaten army, it becomes again only the auxiliary arm, because the troops in retreat can employ fresh reserves to cover the movement, and therefore, at the next trifling obstacle of ground, by combining all arms they can make a stand with success. The only exception to this is in the case of an army in actual flight in a complete state of dissolution. The second degree is if the pursuit is made by a strong advance guard composed of all arms, the greater part consisting naturally of cavalry. Such a pursuit generally drives the enemy as far as the nearest strong position for his rear guard, or the next position affording space for his army. Neither can usually be found at once, and therefore the pursuit can be carried further. Generally, however, it does not extend beyond the distance of one or at most a couple of leagues, because otherwise the advance guard would not feel itself sufficiently supported. The third and most vigorous degree is when the victorious army itself continues to advance as far as its physical powers can endure. In this case, the beaten army will generally quit such ordinary positions, as a counter usually offers, on the mere show of an attack, or of an intention to turn its flank, and the rear guard will be still less likely to engage in an obstinate resistance. In all three cases, the knight, if it sets before the conclusion of the whole act, usually puts an end to it, and the few instances in which this has not taken place and the pursuit has been continued throughout the night must be regarded as pursuit in an exceptionally vigorous form. If we reflect that in fighting by night everything must be more or less abandoned to chance, and that at the conclusion of the battle, the regular cohesion and order of things in an army must inevitably be disturbed, we may easily conceive the reluctance of both generals to carrying on their business under such disadvantageous conditions. If a complete dissolution of the vanquished army or a rare superiority of the victorious army in military virtue does not ensure success, everything would in a manner be given up to fate, which can never be for the interest of anyone, even of the most foolhardy general. As a rule, therefore, night puts an end to pursuit, even when the battle has only been decided shortly before darkness sets in. This allows the conquered either time for rest and to rally immediately, or if he retreats during the night, it gives him a march in advance. After this break, the conquered is decidedly in a better condition. Much of that which had been thrown into confusion has been brought again into order. Ammunition has been renewed. The wall has been put into a fresh formation. Whatever further encounter now takes place with the enemy is a new battle, not a continuation of the old, and although it may be far from promising absolute success, still it is a fresh combat, and not merely a gathering up of the debris by the victor. When therefore the conqueror can continue the pursuit itself throughout the night, if only with a strong advance guard composed of all arms of the service, the effect of the victory is immensely increased. Of this, the battles of Leuthen and La Belle Alliance are examples. The whole action of this pursuit is mainly tactical, and we only dwell upon it here in order to make plain the difference, which through it may be produced in the effect of a victory. So this is a very long chapter, and the text we've just read is just like 1/3 of it, so it eventually expands. But this part is already fascinating. Von Clausewitz starts by introducing the point that, of course, it's not much about even just fighting the battle that counts, but naturally preparing it, and even within it, considering certain dimensions to go specifically beyond the combat, or at least the main action, and have to do also, as we've seen before, in the previous chapters, with how you manage the pursuit, how with the conditions in there are concerned, and how this all leads to. And so that there is specifically a way to prepare for the battle, right? And not just properly just the victory, but just those conditions that make the victory more likely, which sounds a bit of a circle if you think about it, but it's really not in practice, as that's specifically a strategical problem, right? It is about convincing even the enemy to give battle. So this is all a part of things. Now, von Clausewitz dwells in this chapter specifically into tactics, right? There is probably also a pinch of strategy in here, as we see that there is a passage between two different fights. So basically, especially during the night, if you understood the text, there is this moment in which you can regroup as a winner and can replenish your forces and so on, and therefore pushing against the enemy the next day, completing in that sense something through tactical means, but still at the strategical level. And he also explains in this text how there are different ways naturally a pursuit can be carried out, if anything also just by the of course, because of also the possibility of what you can do, what the situation can from the situation you can afford, but also probably different types, different intensity grades of the pursuit that are carried out practically in different ways. So without much further ado, let's reread. So strategic means of utilizing victory. So you understand here we're talking about strategic means in theory, right? Just this whole part is mostly about tactics, but still framed naturally, unavoidably, into a strategical logic that we have tried to summarize right now. So reading, the more difficult part, that is, that of perfectly preparing the victory. Right, this can happen before combat, but also properly, as this text shows, during or after. Right, which is paradoxical. You understand, because as we just said, there is a passage that point between from a combat to another, so two different battles in Clausewitzian terms, but still part of this broader possibility, in fact, of expanding the strategic effects of victory, preparing, in fact, for the same troops that had just want to further pressure, to carry out a further pressure on the enemy. That's properly the strategic meaning in that sense. So this most difficult part is a silent service of which the merit belongs to strategy, and yet for which it is hardly sufficient command. So that the battle in itself, of course, is conceived always in its strategic function. Therefore, we cannot exclude it, not even thinking that the battle is just the combat, the tactics all. Right? It's obviously also how you handle this tactical unit, right, and how you connect the strategic dimension to the tactical one, even during the combat itself, or even after it's been fought. He writes, it appears brilliant and full of renown by turning to good account a victory gained. So that, in fact, it's not just about winning. The engagement is also about making good use of this outcome. Von Clausewitz writes, what may be the special object of a battle, how it is connected with the whole system of a war, whither the career of victory may lead according to the nature of circumstances, where its culminating point lies, all these things which we shall not enter upon here until hereafter. But under any conceivable circumstances, the fact holds good that without a pursuit no victory can have a great effect, right? And that, however short the career of a victory may be, it must always lead beyond the first steps in pursuit, right? As we've seen in the previous chapters, without pursuit properly, most of the outcome of fight is, it's not even a big deal. The winner may have even lost more troops than the defeated at the moment. So the pursuit is where probably the largest amount of losses are inflicted. Right? In the expectation, naturally, the pursuit, as we've seen, is the moment in which the guy says, okay, we've lost maybe not so much now, but if there is a point of crisis from which we want to get out as soon as possible, so let's try this. But as we've seen, it's something terribly complicated, right? You can't simply retreat thinking you can do it all the time. Your army is going to break at some point under your own eyes if you don't carry it out under certain circumstances. So, and you may not have them, dispose of them anyway. So these are all things kind of obvious, but we also seen in the previous chapters. And Von Clausewitz says, and in order, but once again, this is quite important because conversely, it makes you understand how active you have to be in the pursuit as a winner as well. And this is not easy. And Von Clausewitz here will highlight how, in fact, exactly because of that moment of crisis has invested both the enemy and you, by that point, you still have to make it ready for it. You have to be very careful, right? Also, how you use your troops, because also maybe an enemy reserve from somewhere else, reinforcements, may be there, and you are in a critical situation before you can organize and replenish your forces. And Von Clausewitz concludes saying, and in order to avoid the frequent repetition of this, we shall now dwell for a moment on this necessary supplement of victory in general. So let's take a look to this strategic element that is very tactical in nature alike, right? So, Von Clausewitz says, the pursuit of a beaten army commences at the moment that army, giving up the combat, leaves its position. So, when does a retreat begins from one side, and when is that the pursuit begins is when the enemy gives properly up the combat, right? He is saying, okay, I will not fight anymore, and leaves its position, right? Which is the same thing practically, in the sense that unless he surrenders immediately, that's what he's obliged to do. Can't stand there just to harmlessly get whatever, either captured or killed, for that matter. So this is important because it begins in ways that are not immediate for the whole army, right? So it goes gradually, and it's going on while combat is still going on. But there is an important conceptual distinction here, because Von Clausewitz says all previous movements in one direction and another belong not to that, but to the progress of the battle itself. So that's probably what the combat is concerned, right? It doesn't matter how much these units have fought in determining what they are doing when they leave their post, giving up the fight. That's the discriminant. Then Von Clausewitz goes on and says, usually victory at the moment here described, even if it is certain, right, given the enemy retreat, is still as yet small and weak in its proportions, and would not rank as an event of any great positive advantage if not completed by pursuit on the first day. Because it's as if virtually this ended really before. It can also not happen like that, in the sense, it always happens like that, but in a way, units may simply break, and there's no way you can control this, and especially if they abandon the post and they don't retreat orderly, it's still technically a big deal. But let's say at least your units are properly pursuing also at a close range, usually, even if they're not specifically ordered by you. There's just the unit, the chain of command that produces this from just spontaneously in a way. So losses are gonna come in some way, even immediately, and quite complementary. But still, here we're drawing a conceptual distinction that has specifically a value for the sake of even the guy who's in first line looks at how he's fleeing and says, what the hell do I have to do about it? And objectively, it's as if this stops while the combat has gone on, because in the moment in which the enemy gives up the fight, you really pursue him, or he goes away. So what happened up to the previous time is that he has been fighting up to then, up to that very moment. The pursuit is the only way to inflict that loss that up to this time, this battle has not been so overwhelmingly produced, as you have just stopped fighting in a way that you probably lost more or less the same amount of forces of the enemy by this point. And Clausewitz says, then it is mostly, as we have before said, that the trophies which give substance to the victory begin to be gathered up. So that's the moment in which we have seen what these trophies are, technically speaking, the prisoners, the artillery, all you can start, those indicators that probably allow you to measure, according to Vom Clausewitz, the entity of a victory. Of this pursuit we shall speak in the next place. Right. So he goes on and says, usually both sides come into action with their physical powers considerably deteriorated, for the movements immediately preceding have generally the character of very urgent circumstances, right? This is very typical. And often armies also march for kilometers during, even just before arriving to the fighting point in a day. This is typical. If you ever studied, the dimensions of the time of we will talk mostly about medieval or ancient warfare, but you can easily see that, right? There are kilometers that are exhausting sometimes. Think about these marches in full heat or even cold. I mean, it's something can be very hard, especially with all your gear on and the tension, the adrenaline, the anxiety, the fear. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, the efforts which the forging out of a great combat costs complete the exhaustion. Right, so plus when you arrive to the fight, you also exhaust yourself further, obviously. And from this it follows that the victorious party is very little less disorganized and out of his original formation than the vanquished. That's the point we were making before. That is to say, the moment to which the enemy starts fleeing, you're not very different, you and him. You're more or less in the same situation. And therefore, Clausewitz says, requires time to reform, to collect stragglers, and issue fresh ammunition to those who are without. This all starts happening actually during the battle itself, which adds to the further chaos of the war. It says, all these things place the conqueror himself in a state of crisis, of which we have already spoken. If now the defeated force is only a detached portions of the enemy army, or if it has otherwise to expect a considerable reinforcement, then the conqueror may easily run into the obvious danger of having to pay dear for his victory, and this consideration in such a case very soon puts an end to pursuit, or at least restricts it materially. Right. Speaking of combat units, this happens all the time during the battle. Right. And Von Clausewitz is referring, as we've seen also in the previous chapter, concretely to the concept of reserve, right? Here we're not talking specifically of even the loss of a battle overall, but even the loss of a combat between two units in the field. One may be defeated, but there may be a reserve. So at that point you can pursue these guys for a while, but then you find in front of you the enemy that is fresh, and you are already exhausted by all these, the maneuvers, the fight, and even the pursuit that have started. You are in deep trouble. You're easily going to be crushed. There is an overwhelming disparity of forces in this regard, in which numbers also have, after all, few to do with. So this can happen in a broader scenario. Just a sort of strategic, there's a unit that is approaching battlefield somewhere. It's going to arrive at some point, and you may not know. Look at Waterloo, right? And that's exactly what the example von Clausewitz also makes later. Even, he writes, when a strong accession of force by the enemy is not to be feared, the conqueror finds in the above circumstances a powerful check to the vivacity of his pursuit. Right, it's not so easy even just to pursue in conditions in which the enemy is not going to be reinforced, is basically retreat. There is no reason to fear that the victory will be snatched away, but adverse combats are still possible, and may diminish the advantages which up to the present have been gained. This has to do properly with the idea that you don't really know cent per cent which what is going on the field. There may be actually a concealed reserve that is waiting for you to break and burst it and to take you out, because they are still information, you're not. So this is quite difficult even to just understand. And also an orderly retreat can, as we'll see now, detach certain units to just fight against you during the and to stop your maybe sacrificing themselves, but still allowing inflicting losses to you and allowing others to escape. This always happens in a way. So here you have won. So there is no way in this sense the enemy is gonna put up another fight that is going to defeat you unless there's something concealed that you hadn't taken into consideration, right? But if it is retreating, generally it's probably because either it's a feint flight. You understand how flexible it is, but conceptually, as we've seen in previous chapters, it's because the enemy says, okay, there's no way we can win this, let's retreat. So in the decision, in many ways, this thing has already been settled. Moreover, Clausewitz writes, at this moment the whole weight of all that is sensuous in an army, its wants and weaknesses, are dependent on the will of the commander. All the thousands under his command require rest and refreshment, and long to see a stop to put toil and danger for the present. Only a few, forming an exception, can see and feel beyond the present moment if it is only amongst this little number that there is sufficient mental vigor to think, after what is absolutely necessary at the moment has been done, upon those results which at such a moment only appear to the rest as mere embellishments of a victory, is a luxury of triumph. Right? So most of the people out there are actually just waiting for this to stop. And they cause this attrition that we will see in a while, for which you can't really do much to reverse the situation, at least for what they are specifically concerned. There is just a minority of troops that perfectly, more or less perfectly recognize the importance of resisting to perfect the victory, right? To complete the victory. That others would see just like a luxury of triumph, this idea of, these guys are nuts that just want to do something they're not required. Because objectively, you'd say, these people are just people don't understand warfare. It's not mostly about that. It's probably that you are exhausted, and this becomes really a serious problem, right? That is not just may simply break in this regard. It's not about maybe your understanding of the whole situation, or probably the fact that you can't take it anymore. And Von Clausewitz says, but all these thousands, so the majority, have a voice in the council of the general, for through the various steps in the military hierarchy, these interests of the sensuous creature have their sure conductor into the heart of the commander. So that it's not that the commander necessarily feels what the men, directly what the men are suffering. He should know at some level, but the problem is that through the chain of command, if he wants to take action, and the officers of those units that are going to be involved say, look, our man can't take it anymore, the general is going to be naturally limited in his decisional process, right? And therefore there's this weight that is connected to many other attritional factors in here. So it's actually something very difficult to reverse. And what von Clausewitz is actually making us understand is that it's easy to point out exceptions, but the point is that these single factors are overwhelming most of the times. So this is usually what happens basically in every battle, and even when it doesn't happen in the same way, it's usually because there is a specific condition that interferes with this in a very unusual way, right? But that tends, however, you cannot erase properly this thing, because the mental or bodily fatigue is not something you can magically erase because another factor comes into play, right? Like the magical potion of Asterix, when the Gauls fight against the Romans, and it just takes to drink that, it's refresh again. Now, this thing cannot be performed in the field. So, and this affects the general himself, that, as we've seen, has this dramatic, not just responsibility, but proper impact on how the things are going to go, because he has to order all these movements, and it's an extremely difficult task, way more difficult than what the soldier in first line is doing. Right? Can be more terrible in other ways, maybe the latter, but the influences and the realization that these are specifically consequences that can take place are playing overwhelmingly. That's why it takes such a strong-headed person, hard-heartedness, provided with hard-heartedness, as von Clausewitz puts it here, and other qualities too, to take also the lead and to try to, in the sense of trying even to spur his men against their will, or having this charisma that makes his orders being obeyed by his men. So this is another thing, as you understand, but it's still all connected to the wall. In fact, speaking of the general, von Clausewitz writes, he himself, through mental and bodily fatigue, is more or less weakened in his natural activity, and thus it happens then that mostly from these causes, purely incidental to human nature, less is done that might have been done, and that generally what is done is to be ascribed entirely to the thirst for glory, the energy, indeed also the hard-heartedness of the general-in-chief, right? So this is, it's normal to be weak, but and these are forces that are intervening on everyone, but only some people are predisposed to, or disposed just contingentally sometimes to this, to this capacity of resisting, at least enough as for making this whole thing work and remaining steadily, efficient in this moment, and to realize that even the pursuit is actually a great effort, and that needs to be carried out, because it's possibly the most important thing in a battle, for what the strategic mean of it will eventually be, right? So you can't give up, paradoxically, in the hardest moment. And one in which human nature will simply say, okay, let's rest now because we're exhausted. No, that's the moment in which you have to press the hardest, because if you do, you will get an enormous result extra to this, right? That is way superior to what you have done up to that very point. It can be devastatingly difficult to do. That's why Clausewitz also insists so much on it, because he says, I know it's difficult, right? But you must do it if you really want to have this being worth in a way. And von Clausewitz says, it is only thus we can explain the hesitating manner in which many generals follow up a victory which superior numbers have given them. Right? There are certain situations in which generals objectively are not capable of doing it, even if they have an overwhelming success and they don't press further. So this happens sometimes in military history books. You say, why did this guy didn't press further? Was it a plot? Think about, Pompey at Dyrrhachium when he defeated Caesar, or all the situations, or same Vercingetorix actually after Gergovit, just after speaking of Caesar once again, his main defeats in many ways, because they may not have. It's not a plot. May not have had the opportunity. We will never know, right? But just saying that this happens, right? And it's much more, it's much simpler to explain certain realities than plot, think about conspiracies, plot, and so on, capacity, idiocy, right? We also underestimate generals just because they don't. Of course, a general may not be that capable, but it's sometimes not because he's an incapable military man or an individual, but it's just that the pressure posed by this great battle may be so high that even for him it may be excessive, right? So learn not to be so harsh in judging every military reality, because most of the times you don't even know what it means to be there, or why things happen, which is enormously complicated, just to remain at a tactical level, not for talking about all the things that always interplay in this strategically or politically at every single damn moment in all the conduct of war. So, in Foucault it says, at the end of that period, the necessity of rest ourselves prescribes a halt in any case, so that, of course, we're not asking to press on further on the enemy just for the sake of it. We know that at the point we have to stop. The point is, how much does it take, right? And for the object that we want to reach, right? It's all a matter of will, in a way, but also physical forces, of course. And this aspect is very important. All units after a fight have to stop, have to rest, have to be and up to that point you are approaching the crisis in a way, because you could exhaust yourself at the point you're not spendable, and who knows what's going to happen next. Maybe you felt you have defeated the enemy, maybe there's others that are coming. So as you understand, these are all factors that counterbalance the capacity of understanding what is happening, and if you did good or not. Maybe there are situations in which an army gave its best, but maybe they gave too much, and they suffered of it later. So, anyhow, von Clausewitz then passes through to these three types of pursuit, right? These natural degrees of the pursuit action. He says this first pursuit has different natural degrees. So he's talking, as we'll see, specifically of the first pursuit that emerges from the engagement itself, right? So the one you pass from combat to pursuit directly during the battle. And he says the first is if cavalry alone are employed. In that case, it amounts usually more to alarming and watching than to pressing the enemy in reality, because the smallest obstacle of ground is generally sufficient to check the pursuit. Useful as cavalry may be against single bodies of broken, demoralized troops, still when opposed to the bulk of the beaten army it becomes again only the auxiliary arm, because the troops in retreat can employ fresh reserves to cover the movement, and therefore at the next trifling obstacle of ground, by combining all arms they can make a stand with success. The only exception to this is in the case of an army in actual flight in a complete state of dissolution. So this is very interesting, because naturally there's this idea that objectively cavalry is adapted to the pursuit in itself, right? And in part it is true, of course, but we often forget, or at least we tend to forget, as far as I see in general, that cavalry is not the only arm that can perform this, right? There are others. It's important in this sense to be mostly fresh, also light in some ways, but always paying attention, because von Clausewitz says, even for what cavalry is concerned, watch out, because in his times, of course, cavalry. I remember this was a question I once made to a person that maybe didn't fully understand it. Von Clausewitz was here talking objectively about the war situation, right? Cavalry is somewhat the easiest arm to employ in this regard. Also because you can have light, fresh troops to employ, but the point is, how risky it is, right? Especially just think about the invention of firearms and so on, to properly, overwhelm an enemy this routing. Maybe we're used to see this, especially in ancient and medieval times, where all what the army was could be basically fought in the field and could be pursued easily, and there were also smaller, so cavalry had a great importance. In Napoleonic times, it starts being more complex, because if you think about armies that have fielded, tens of thousands of troops, and these are very articulated, many of them are in reserve, etc. So you may actually leave the field with an enormous amount of troops that have not fought and are still basically functional, and together with all their complement, and with all their arms intact. So let's say you send in cavalry, Well, at this point, you can find help. There are even retreating squares, right? We have even many people think a square is a barely mobile thing. Actually, squares retreat. We have news of terrible defeats like the one of Vienna at Auerstedt, specifically, if I'm not wrong. It was a Saxon battalion that retreated in square and fenced off I think it was probably the French, the French units, however, from French army, that all the way, right, and they saved themselves. Just imagine if you can deploy light artillery or other cavalry, right, and so it's not that easy. You can't simply send troops in that are simply, we can say, okay, the enemy is completely broken, we're just going to overwhelm them. It's actually more complicated. And von Clausewitz says you can't do this when the enemy army is in actual flight in a complete state of dissolution. For the rest, cavalry may not be sufficient, most of the times, actually. Or at least it can produce some good results, but mostly for, like a shepherd, right, that, maybe guides the retreat of these people towards an easier area for the rest of the army to chop them up, or that is always this pressing figure that wears you out psychologically. So it can be very complex, but still, let's not think it's all, right? Von Clausewitz says, the second degree is, if the pursuit is made by a strong advance guard composed of all arms, the greater part consisting naturally of cavalry. Such a pursuit generally drives the enemy as far as the nearest strong position for his rear guard, or the next position affording space for army. Neither can usually be found at once. Therefore, the pursuit can't be carried further. Generally, however, it does not extend the distance of one or at most a couple of leagues, because otherwise the advance guard would not feel itself sufficiently supported, right? The third and most vigorous degree, this is actually it's part of a different paragraph. So the second one is when you have instead a specific, here it says advance guard, but any corps in this sense is composed by all arms, so that can combine effectively, with combined arms, concentrated forces, its destructive powers on the enemies that are retreating. Even in here, they may not be enough, but still they're way more effective, right? And still, you have to watch out not to overstretch the distance between this advance guard and and the rest of the arm. The third one, the third and most vigorous degree is when the victorious army itself continues to advance as far as its physical powers can endure. Right? It's not terribly frequent, right? And it's obvious that it's here by degrees. It's always more difficult to carry out this thing effectively, especially. And in this case, the beaten army will generally quit such ordinary positions as a counter usually offers on the mere show of an attack or of an intention to turn its flank, and the rear guard will be still less likely to engage in obstinate resistance. So this is kind of interesting because it tells you that at that point it's way more difficult, but it's way more effective. And that's exactly to that point we were saying before, right? It's damn difficult, but if you manage to do it, the results can be enormous. Unfortunately, such a big army, as we've seen before, also to have this majority of thousands of people say, let us rest. It's a torture, right? And generally speaking, there's also the risk we were saying before, but it has an enormous, just even psychological impact. It says that the only side of this thing advancing, the whole army advancing, during the retreat, the enemy will practically abandon every single post, every single ground. This is interesting also because it naturally contemplates a situation that is quite difficult to see militarily historically, right? It can be achieved, but we're talking about much shorter distances than the usual. So von Clausewitz says, in all three cases, however, the night, so you understand that here the time is not, endless. It says if it sets in before the conclusion of the wall act, usually puts an end to it, and the few instances in which this has not taken place and the pursuit has been continued throughout the night must be regarded as pursuits in an exceptionally vigorous form. This is even more interesting because, as we were saying before, usually, it's not the night in itself. The night, and now for Clausewitz will specify better what it means, what happens at that point, because the night brings objectively certain problems within itself that, aside from how exhausted you are after the fighting day, objectively can complicate the situation. But in this regard, who is capable of carrying that out is who has this dramatically vigorous capacity of pursuing in that context. And that can really overwhelm the enemy in ways that are unbelievable, right? Von Clausewitz writes, if we reflect that in fighting by night, everything must be more or less abandoned to chance, right? And that at the conclusion of a battle, the regular cohesion and order of things in an army must inevitably be disturbed, we may easily conceive the reluctance of both generals to carrying on their business under such advantageous conditions. Right. The question here is not also, so during the night, as we have seen, there is even just a difficulty to control your forces, right? And fundamentally, it becomes a problem of command to operate by night in this sense. So the general usually is not up to it, right? And also wisely, because we've seen that the risk in many ways can increase at the same time. It's not just the difficulty of the performance, it's properly the risk of saying, but what control will we have eventually of our troops during the night? It's a very complicated affair, and naturally we're realizing here that we're talking about large numbers of troops. So it's not just a commander that is able to do that because they're being trained to do whatever the frick they are ordered. There are a few people. Here we're talking about thousands that, by sending in at night, you basically accept to lose control of during the same, and therefore, posing many problems of the continuity of command and what will happen when the sun will rising in. Von Clausewitz says, if a complete dissolution of the vanquished army or a rare superiority of the victorious army military virtue does not ensure success, everything would in a manner be given up to fate, which can never be for the interest of any one, even of the most foolhardy general. As a rule, therefore, night puts an end to pursuit, even when the battle has only been decided shortly before darkness sets in. Right. So, this is the conclusion that describes what happens on average, because this is what all Vom Kriege is conceived in this sense. What happens on average in war, and why does it? Right. So it's not chance. There is a specific consolidation around the average of the reality that we should take into consideration, from which we draw this theory itself. So it's the same thing actually. So the night puts an end to properly the fight, right? Properly to the battle. However, it's gone, right? For Clausewitz writes, after this break, the conquered. This allows, first of all, the conquered either time for rest and rally immediately, or if he retreats during the night, it gives him a march in advance. Yes. After this break, the conquered is decidedly in a better condition. Much of that which had been thrown into confusion has been placed with the enemy, has been brought again into order. Ammunition has been renewed, the wall has been put into fresh formation. Whatever further encounter now takes place with the enemy is a new battle, not a continuation of the old, and although it may be far from promising absolute success, still it is a fresh combat and not merely a gathering up of the debris by the victor. So the night naturally puts an end to both contendants' struggle. What von Clausewitz is highlighting here is that technically the night for the defeated is a great opportunity to flee, right? And also because the as we've seen it, as far as the moral forces are concerned, the moral effects on the enemy are on the defeated are much more devastating than the one of the of the victor, which means that it's easier for the winner to give up the fight than for the defeated to stop running, right? Giving up the retreat. What does this mean? It means that usually knight does help tendentially more the defeated, but at the same time, this is just for how the retreat in itself is concerned, not the possibility of putting up another fight, because both armies are gathering strength again, reordering and so on. So if the next day a new fight is started again, generally speaking, it's going to be very difficult for the defeated to now win its opponent. But still, this is properly another fight, right? It's not like the leftovers of the day before. This is another army technically capable of putting up another fight, right? It's just that what's been settled the day before at that point has had this overwhelming impact usually, right? And mostly for the greatest battles, and that, as von Clausewitz has explained, this capacity also of the defeated to fight back another day, the day after, let's say, is just the smaller the armies are. I mean, not always, but statistically, that capacity increases. Also because of the attrition of the whole army systemically speaking. That is to say, it's much easier to reform and put back together, few troops in proportion than larger ones. Right? Not properly because they are less, but with extra ease because of there is less to put together in the first place in its complication, let's say, as a system, in its interrelations. So von Clausewitz says, when therefore the conqueror can continue the pursuit itself throughout the night, if only with a strong advance guard composed of all arms of the service, the effect of the victory is immensely increased. Of these battles of Leuthen and La Belle Alliance, this Waterloo, are examples, right? So that's the most prudent thing to do. Mostly, if you just have to send cavalry to skirmish, to harass, to hope to catch someone, and just make the whole army advance, the good medium is just send this strong advance guard further. So that is usually the best way to cope with that, and Battle of Leuthen and Waterloo are a good example of this as well. And that's going to do, right? And everything is naturally balanced, depending on the situation, as always. You sometimes may be easier doing something, and at that point it is probably not even just a tactical problem, but it's not just, right? It can have other, it can be a decision that is due to the interference of other factors that elude that combat unit of that engagement, right? That there may be another enemy approaching, things like this. So it always depends. It can always change. There's just no you can't do it every time, or that you have to do it every time. No, right? It may be even counterproductive at some point. And von Clausewitz, for now, concludes this part saying that the whole action of this pursuit is mainly tactical. Right? We have been discussing, in fact, of a tactical problem, chiefly, right? And we only dwell upon it there in order to make plain the difference, which though it may be produced in the effect of victory, right? So this is quite important as well, and it is something that will have this dramatic consequences afterwards, because the more losses you're able to inflict, the easiest it's going to be later in practice for the outcome of the campaign and so on. However, for now stop it here. Naturally, this is, as we were saying at the beginning, this is just a part of the chapter. It's fairly long, so I don't know if next time we will be able to finish it, but yeah, I think we could. Here I don't see extreme problems, but yeah, maybe it's a bit too long. We'll see. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.